So I don't usually make it my business to hang out in garages, but there's an event at the end of the month that actually might get me to do it even without meeting a secret source. The Garage Racing National Championships are back Saturday, February 22nd in Arlington's National Landing. What started as a quirky garage race in 2012 has since grown into a national competition drawing riders from 7 states and DC to compete underground. And the best part, it is free to watch. The Garage Racing National Championships, Saturday, February 22nd from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., free for spectators. RSVPs encouraged at nationallanding.org/racing. See you underground.
Today on CityCast DC, DC is on tenterhooks waiting for a judge in Massachusetts to decide whether or not the Trump administration's deferred resignation offer is actually legit. That's their proposal that federal workers could quit now and just kind of coast and get paid until the end of September. But the whole thing might be illegal. Brad Moss is a DC attorney who represents federal employees, and he's here to explain what's happening in the courts and how federal workers are responding. Today's Tuesday, February 11th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. Brad, it has been a lot going on today. I appreciate you joining us from your car, no less.
Not a problem. Anytime. Happy to assist in this current craziness that we're all trying to deal with these days.
So let's just get into it. This is my understanding. I am not a lawyer, but this is my sense of what's happening. So as of 6 p.m. on Monday, federal judge George O'Toole in Massachusetts has indefinitely paused the deferred resignation offer from the Trump administration. This is very confusing. It's confusing for me. It's got to also be confusing for all those federal workers who are mulling over whether or not to accept this offer to resign. How are people that you're talking to reacting to this kind of purgatory that they're in?
Yeah, trust me, if it's confusing for you, if it's confusing for the workers, you have no idea how confusing it is for the lawyers right now trying to make sense of this. By and large, they are confused, bewildered, and wondering what on earth is going on. So, put it into perspective, a lot of these civil servants, they do it out of a devotion and patriotism to the country. Civil service, despite what you might see on TV or hear in political talking points, is not a lucrative way to go through life. The salary is decent. You can make a middle-class living off it, but it's not equivalent to what you can make in the private sector for certain. The benefits are nice. The health benefits are nice, but you're not going to be living in a mansion based off being a civil servant for the most part. So they're very much sort of in a state of shock, trying to understand what's going to happen to their jobs. Are they going to be there next week? Are their bosses going to be there next week? And they just want to still be able to operate within the structures that were set up for them, that was put forth in federal law decades ago when we got rid of political patronage and we instituted civil service reforms. That was the entire concept of modern government in the United States, was that we were not going to be Tammany Hall anymore. It was going to be a civil service of experts who were there administration to administration. And that's all being put into jeopardy right now.
Just as quick background for anybody not paying attention, how did we get here?
So what the situation is, to try to simplify it, is basically the Trump administration came in and they came up with this idea to internally sort of offer a buyout to the entirety of the federal workforce, with some national security exclusions, but by and large, the majority of civil servants. And they fashioned it off of what Elon Musk had done at Twitter when he bought that back in 2022. It was basically this: here's a buyout offer. You have, 5 to 10 days to accept it. If you don't take it, your job's not guaranteed. And by the way, we're going to be going through all kinds of reforms, so you have no idea what you're going to be dealing with. A whole bunch of groups immediately filed suit saying, you don't have the power to do this in its current form. Basically, the essential nature of this lawsuit and what the judge is currently considering is, can the executive branch, on its own, without any input or authorization from Congress, put up U.S. government funds to buy out federal workers? The essence of the lawsuit says no. Says there's a piece of federal law called the Anti-Deficiency Act, basically says the federal government, namely the executive, can't agree to spend funds that haven't actually been authorized. And so this lawsuit was brought to basically say this offer, this buyout, is itself illegal because the executive never had the authority to do this. If you want to do a buyout, like what was done in the 90s when Bill Clinton was president, you have to run it through Congress. Congress has to appropriate funds, outline criteria, and set forth a mechanism by which to buy out these officials.
Who exactly brought this lawsuit forward?
I believe the organization, and I'm going to butcher the acronym, I believe it's AFSCME. It's basically one of the various unions or associations for civil servants, for federal employees, that represents any number of government employees, primarily outside the national security arena, but who nonetheless are civil servants who have various statutory protections under the law. Representing those individuals, bringing it as an organization on their behalf. And they're bringing it against the Office of Personnel Management, which is the one that technically oversees all personnel matters, and bringing it against the White House, obviously. But essentially, it's against the U.S. government, saying you can't do this in its current form. The whole thing needs to be thrown out. The buyout offers that were accepted need to be nullified. You need to go through the proper legal procedures in order to do what you want to do.
So what's the government saying? Like, what's their counter argument to that?
In essence, they're claiming that the president has the inherent authority under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution to fire or otherwise essentially buy out these employees at any time he wants. The way the Trump administration approaches the idea of executive authority is very much the notion of what's called the unitary executive, which is that the executive branch is the all-powerful of the three branches, and that it can more or less do whatever it wants with the entities within its control without interference from the judiciary or Congress. That has always failed in the past, but it's always been sort of a back and forth, balancing act. We've had times where the executive's been weakened and the times where it's been strong, strengthened. Donald Trump clearly is trying to make it a stronger executive.
I mean, does he have this authority, or is he giving himself this authority because he's Trump?
He's sort of, in essence, he's claiming authority because this is how Donald Trump thinks. I mean, to be fair, think of it in the mindset of Donald Trump. He has been the king of whatever room he's walked into for the last 50 years. He's been the CEO of every company he's run. He's always been the main guy, and he's never been accustomed to someone telling him, you can't do this within the organization you run. Federal government is a different animal. It doesn't naturally adhere to those rules because it's based off federal laws. There's statutory protections for various civil servants. And ultimately, the people who work there don't work for him. They work for the office of the president, and their ultimate loyalty is not to him, but to the U.S. Constitution. So it's not surprising he would take this approach. He's not the first president to take this approach. Richard Nixon took very similar approaches. Abraham Lincoln took similar approaches, had a very unitary, executive style approach to how this would work. But it's not surprising they would take this type of view of how the president will manage the executive branch. And we don't really know. As much as we've seen precedent in the past, as much as we understand customs and norms, no one can say for certain how the courts will ultimately view this, and particularly assuming it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, how the 9 men and women in black robes will decide it in the end.
Is that the next step here? Like, could this go all the way to the Supreme Court?
It absolutely could, depending on what this district court judge does. There was obviously the hearing this morning. We're waiting a decision today, tomorrow, sometime this week. But whichever side loses can absolutely appeal it up first to the appellate courts. That could take some time. And then ultimately could go up to the Supreme Court. But it's more than likely that whoever loses and appeals up, the existing status quo will be frozen. Nothing will happen one way or the other. People won't be forced into the buyouts. The government won't be able to push them out until this is resolved. So it's February right now. If this gets expedited because this is all emergency temporary restraining orders, you could see it resolved by the end of spring.
So I'm curious, based on how the court has previously ruled, what do you think will happen?
It's tough to say because this court has clearly taken, as it's been modified, due in no small part to the appointments that Donald Trump made in his first term, it's certainly taking more strengthened, more powerful executive approach in terms of the authorities of the president. We saw that with the immunity ruling with respect to Donald Trump, with respect to criminal actions taken while president. We've seen that with a number of things in terms of how this court over the last few years has sort of approached executive authority. That being said, even this court just a few years ago had put limits on the power of the executive to fire individuals within the United States government, including an opinion drafted by Clarence Thomas, of all people, who is by and large usually a proponent for a stronger executive, and he authored an opinion pushing back on it. So it's not out of the realm of possibilities that even with this court, even with these appointees that Donald Trump put on the bench, that they would still push back and say, no, you've gone too far. But no one knows for certain.
So let's talk about the folks who already accepted the deferred resignation offer. That's about 65,000 people. What happens to them if this judge fully overturns this program?
In theory, that's all. I mean, right now it's all put on hold. And if it's overturned, if the judge rules against the government's almost certainly going to immediately appeal and seek what's known as administrative stay, basically freezing the status quo. Those people will basically be sitting there not knowing really what's going on, but they're also not for certain that they're going to have to return to work at all. It's going to put things on hold for a while this can work its way through the appellate litigation. It'll be on an expedited time frame, certainly compared to what you would normally expect, which is that this kind of thing would take 2 to 3 years. It could easily be expedited to a few months, depending on how quickly the appellate circuit works and then how quickly the Supreme Court can intervene. I mean, mind you, this was 3% of the workforce. It's ultimately, not a huge amount, and it's smaller than the amount that took a similar buyout during the 90s with Clinton. Most of those probably had their own personal reasons and benefits to taking this path. Maybe they were willing to look aside from, the history of Donald Trump, thinking the federal government was going to be the backstop. But in the end here, this is going to have to be resolved by the courts. I expect it to be resolved by the courts. And it's not going to be the only thing, most likely, that's going to go up to the Supreme Court, given all of the various litigation across the country right now against all these executive orders and actions that his administration has taken in this first, 3 weeks.
What were the circumstances around the Clinton buyout? Like, how did that shake out?
So when Clinton came into office and ultimately Republicans took control of Congress, it was part of that, the era of big government is over mindset. There was a desire to sort of streamline some parts of federal government that had become too bloated over the years. And so it was an action through Congress. The House and Senate passed a bill that authorized funding and outlined criteria by which federal workers could take a buyout and ultimately leave government service without having to go through resigning or being fired or anything like that, and allowed the government to sort of, cull some of the fat. I think about approximately 240,000 people took that buyout, but it was done through the congressional process. All Clinton did was sign it into law. But Donald Trump doesn't want to do that because that takes time and that requires congressional action. And Donald Trump is not someone accustomed to having to go to another entity to authorize what he wants to do. It's the I will just, move quick and be legends phase of the administration. They're going to see how much they can get away with.
In times like these, times that feel kind of dark, I constantly find myself leaning into art and history for inspiration. The arts can provide solace from the seemingly constant barrage of bad news, and history can give us hope and light and show us a path forward. That's why this month, I can't wait to see Fuente Ovejuna at the Gala Theater. Fuente Ovejuna tells the story of a town where women lead an uprising against a tyrant, taking up arms and confronting the authorities. It's one of Spain's most famous plays by the legendary Lope de Vega, and it's headed at Gala by award-winning director Jose Luis Arellano. Witness the people rise up against oppression. The show is in Spanish with English subtitles and runs February 6th through March 2nd. Get more information and tickets at galatheater.org. That's galatheater.org. CityCast is made possible by the Peabody Institute of the Johns Hopkins University, celebrating 1 year of performances at the university's Bloomberg Center, located at 555 Pennsylvania Avenue in D.C. This spring, immerse yourself in the vibrant offerings at D.C.'s newest venue for music and dance. Featuring a full season of free performances, experience a dynamic range of events, including orchestral, jazz, and chamber music, all presented by esteemed Peabody faculty, students, alumni, and special guests. Highlights of the season include Songs from Inside on February 14th, a chamber choral performance highlighting the experiences of incarcerated writers in history and the present, and Load Bang on April 30th, a music chamber ensemble performing works by Peabody composition faculty, Guggenheim Fellows, and Pulitzer Prize finalist Felipe Lara. While all events are free, tickets are required for entry. Explore the full performance schedule, find out more details, and reserve your tickets at washingtondc.jhu.edu. So I have to imagine that some folks are now worried that they sent in their resignation or their intent to resign this way that they were prompted to do. And now maybe it feels like they're just on a list to be first fired. Like, is that a sense that you're getting from folks?
I think some of them certainly are feeling like they may have been hoodwinked in this whole thing, putting aside the fact that everybody was warning them not to do it. There was the idea of, I've now indicated my desire to leave. Even if this, if this goes, by the wayside, if I just, obviously put a target on my back, that's obviously an understandable position. I wouldn't be surprised of those approximately 65,000 people if a lot of them were nearing retirement anyway, and that was why they were looking to take this deal. They could get their benefits, they could get their pension, and they could get the buyout offer, and they could possibly come back separately as contractors. So they might leave anyways in the end, but it's certainly put them in a sort of limbo position because they don't know where they stand, and they don't know to what extent they will, like I said, have that target on their back if they have to return.
Is it possible? Like, could they take back their resignation?
They absolutely could. And if the buyouts are sort of nullified, in effect, the resignation will have never happened. That being said, if this does go by the wayside, I would expect to see congressional action to more or less find a, path out for those individuals, authorize something so they could effectively still take what had been the buyout for that limited group of people.
Has this pause really shaped or changed what you, in your position as an attorney, is recommending folks do when it comes to this offer?
I have pretty much made clear, with the recognition that everybody's situation is different and there may be personal circumstances why some people may have wanted to take the buyout at the time. For now, given the status of the situation, my general guidance has been, do not do it right now. You don't know what's going to happen to it next week. You don't know what's going to happen to it next month. It's too risky. You don't even know if the funding is properly there. It's not a good option for you at this moment. It might be, if there is a way to fix this legislatively, that they can ultimately go that path if they want to. But at the moment, my general guidance has been, don't do it.
Let me ask you this, because this is what was really troubling me about this. And I don't know if you can speak to this at all, but let's say that a judge orders Trump not to do this, and they do it anyway. What happens then? Like, I guess we were talking earlier about the power of the executive branch. I think most of us learned in grade school that there's checks and balances, like parts of the government are supposed to check and balance the other parts of the government. What happens if Trump is like, nah?
So that is sort of the, break glass in case of emergency crisis we fear right now. We saw some of it over the weekend from, Vice President Vance, from Elon Musk, from Stephen Miller, the idea that these judges should just be ignored, that the executive might just not comply. It's certainly a concern that if in the end the courts rule against Donald Trump and he refuses to comply, the ability of the courts to enforce their rulings is ultimately tied to the executive branch. And if the executive branch refuses to comply with it, we don't know from a societal standpoint, from a political, from a constitutional standpoint, what will happen next. But that is the very essence of a constitutional crisis. And it's the kind of crisis we haven't had since, I don't know, the 19th century.
No big deal. Just our entire democracy being held together by bubble gum and shoestring. No big deal. No big deal.
And duct tape, pretty much. That's about all that's left.
While I've got you here, we heard that federal workers got emails last week saying that they have to be back in the office by March 17th, regardless of any remote work protections that they might have gotten in union contracts. Can they do that? Is that legal?
So that's a subject of another set of lawsuits, which the groups that have, mind you, most of the federal workforce does not have collective bargaining rights. There's only a portion of it does. The entire national security apparatus, none of them have those kind of collective bargaining rights. But for those who do, who are being forced into this return to work situation, that's going to be the subject of litigation as well in terms of the arbitrary way in which it was done. But if you put aside even the legality of can they do that, the bigger question became why? One of the primary, approaches for conservatives especially was always the idea that the federal government owned too much property, too many buildings, too many facilities. They're paying all this money on it. It's too big of a landscape. We need to shrink the size of the brick and mortar aspect of federal government. Well, allowing remote work for all these officials gave the government the ability to do that, to start closing down these excess facilities. But if you start bringing all these people back, you got to put them somewhere. They have to be in their offices. They have to have that proper space. It has to be accredited by the General Services Administration. That eliminates your ability to shrink the size of the federal facility, landscape. And so it has that, perverse, disincentive that it keeps the size of those assets and it keeps those expenses in place, despite what had been conservatives' desire for a generation or two.
Well, Brad, thank you for being here. Thank you for shedding light on all of this. Strange, strange times. I don't know what else to say.
I'm tired of living in interesting times. I prefer to go back to simpler ones.
Yeah, give me some simple times, some bland times. I'll take it.
Exactly. All right, well, have a good night.
Thanks so much. That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, send it to your friend that is constantly refreshing their browser, anxious for updates on deferred resignations. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.